As the sun sets on the industrial era, and we enter a long twilight of uncertainty, worlds of ideas and technologies remain to be explored. Welcome to the Bones of the Empire podcast and blog, where we pick clean the remains of civilizations, past, present, and future, looking for tools to adapt to an unstable world. Political discourse in Western countries is trapped in the narrow confines of left-right worldview. The cadence struck by this binary marches India sluggishly from subjugation to liberation. On the left step spring three foreign ideologies that actively seek the dissolution of the Indian Union and annihilation of its indigenous culture. On the right step rise a disorganized tide of native ideologies that cannot practically define themselves. All that can be heard from faraway shores are the rhythms, but not the reason, for the stomp, clap, and shuffle of moving feet. India does not dance to a two-step tune. A country with 30 official languages, hundreds of unofficial ones that have over 1 million speakers, a galaxy of religious practices, local histories stretching back millennia, communal hierarchies, and clan rivalries can never produce a cultural duopoly, let alone a monopoly of power. Yet, academics and politicians in the West insist on engaging India with the same binaries that they use to trap their own countries and cultures. Demonstrate the inconsistencies that emerge when Western standards are applied to the Indian experience to any Western-educated Indologist, and you're guaranteed a screaming temper tantrum that would shame a 5-year-old. Power struggles are always convoluted and messy, but India's political climate would cause Machiavelli himself to back away nervously. He was considerably wiser than most of India's foreign suitors, who, by sheer ignorance, malice, stupidity, or some combination thereof, believe they can define and control the Indian people. These ideologues are committed to some brand of expansionism, and while they are unable to directly control the country's destiny, they use proxies in academia, media, and politics to exert considerable influence on India's development. It is into this churn that we must venture next, but before we jump onto wholly unfamiliar territory, we need to get a sense of the terrain. Key differences between Indian and Western terminology exist and must be mapped. To that end, we need to take a detour into the weird country of pop occultism, the even weirder country of modern American politics. For those of you who just felt your shoulders tense, please relax. This is just a mapping expedition, not a colonization effort. Every serious occultist knows that magic is still practiced in our culture. The dark arts survived religious persecution, the expansion of rationalism, and just about any other disaster you care to name. Strangely enough, there is nothing particularly supernatural that allowed real magic to survive. As every practitioner knows, the rules of magic are simply the observation and categorization of natural forces. They don't go away no matter how many witches you burn. Dion Fortune, the highly respected 20th century British occult practitioner and philosopher, defined magic as the art and science of changing consciousness in accordance with one's will. A stage magician makes a ball disappear by using sleight of hand or misdirecting your conscious awareness. You see what he wants you to see and are entertained by the results. Philosophers were also quick to understand the limitation of perception and taught their students to explore that limitation through conscious inquiry. How do you know what you know? They are fond of asking. Politicians and propagandists use the same principles to different effect by wielding words and symbols to sway the subconscious of whole nations to march them, as is frequently claimed, towards greatness and glory. The political instrument is less subtle than its stage magic peer, less benevolent than its philosophical peer, and simply hammers your subconscious mind into submission. Each of these professions use the limitations of human consciousness to change our perception of the world. The different methods of manipulating our perception gave rise to two tropes in modern pulp fantasy. Wizards and sorcerers muttering spells in secret arcane languages before shooting lightning out of whatever orifice magic lightning emerges from, or enchanting some unwary soul, is the most well-known trope. I can tell you from personal experience, the first trope is actually true to a degree. Occultists come up with secret languages all the time, and it's a point of pride for most of them to be impossible to understand by the public. The reason behind those secret languages is actually found in a second and lesser known trope known as the rule of names. In many fantasy stories, knowing something's true name gives you power over the thing. A hero may discover the true name of a dragon and promptly weaponize the lizard against whatever Dark Lord happens to be wandering about. Particularly lazy writers cut the extra step out of the story and simply ensure the big bad has a true name for the hero to discover. Or even worse, ensure the hero is simply born knowing the true names of all things. It should go without saying, and yet I find myself saying it, that nothing in life has a true name. Names are descriptions of characteristics, and characteristics change. Here, for example, we have a lion, sharp in tooth and claw. Suddenly realizing that the lion's mum named him Fred, and yelling, "Fred, please stop ripping me to shreds," isn't going to do you much good if Fred happens to be going at you with the tools of his trade. A lion is subject to its own internal reality, which are shaped by the particular circumstances of its life. To be useful to us, any name we choose to apply to the lion or all lions must capture as many of the actual characteristics of lions as possible. Words and names provide us lenses which we can use to navigate dangerous and uncertain environments. Magicians, like their political and philosopher counterparts, realize that the right word can change our perception of reality, and put that knowledge to use by carefully choosing names for their environments. That's one secret of the rule of names. A carefully chosen name or word allows you to consciously modify your perception of a fluid reality, and opens new ways to navigate or interact with your environment that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Knowing the secret name didn't give you power over the thing, but power over your perception of the thing. Names were purposefully kept secret to prevent the uninitiated from gaining access to that perspective shift. Academic culture grew on the discoveries of philosophy, and knew how words shaped perceptions. To no one's surprise, the concept was given multiple names: first principles, collective bias, bigotry, prejudice, frame of reference, and the list goes on. Systematic study of perceptive limitations were done, but the lessons were never popularly accepted amongst academicians. Their subculture is riddled with people who use the rule of names like their hero in a pulp fantasy novel. They painstakingly craft the most accurate name for an idea, as if by sheer accuracy they can manifest that idea in the real world. Willing the meaning of a name to manifest isn't actually possible unless the name becomes common enough to change popular culture. But the moment the name becomes widely known, it loses its accuracy, and the changes it effects may be far away from those intended by the original speaker. George Orwell wrote in his classic essay on the English language that it is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy. He went on to say, words of this kind are used in a conscientiously dishonest way. The more widely known a word, the more favored the concept a word describes, the more likely its meaning is to become contested. Any word that moves from person to person, country to country, mind to mind, will eventually lose the intent of its original meaning. Freedom can just as easily mean slavery, and slavery, freedom. Descriptions of the world are always a three-way negotiation between nature, culture, and desire. A speaker desires to convey a meaning and chooses their words to match their intent. Intent is interpreted by a listener, and if the speaker and listener share a similar understanding of the world, then they can reach a common place. Whether the ground is actually there when the speakers reach it depends wholly on the uncontrollable movements of nature. Human society never accepted the weaker bargaining position in our endless negotiations with nature. We took the rule of names, our capacity to define, and built entire institutions to unify our desire and focus our intent to get a better position at the table. In one form or another, every human society developed institutions of the mind to identify and define the movements of nature, and institutions of the voice to popularize those discoveries. In modern parlance, we call those institutions academia and media, the highly specialized organs of our society that manage and propagate our collective understanding or narrative of the world. Scaling the rule of names into a narrative creates a second and far more dangerous problem. A definition, by its very nature, is an act of negation. We define everything as much by what it is as by what it isn't, meaning, inevitably, every time we name something and give it a place in our cultural awareness, we unintentionally define something out of our awareness. By monopolizing the channels of narration, a small minority can concentrate the awareness of a society to divert rivers, move mountains, or even walk on the face of the moon. But influence should never be mistaken for control. Monopolize the narrative long enough, and you'll begin to believe you've discovered the true name of power. Outside your awareness, the environmental consequences of your success begin to accumulate. No political ideology ever escaped the consequences of monopolizing the narrative, and no political ideology ever will escape, since politics is simply the collective management of naming and negotiation. In the United States, we can even see the breakdowns of negotiations between desire, culture, and nature in both the 2016 and 2020 elections. In the former case, Donald Trump's campaign took full advantage of the disillusion of the partnership between the Republican Party's desire and the culture of its supporters, then leveraged his victory there to defeat his Democratic opponents. Nature played a significant but subtle role in the end of the Dem-Rep duopoly. Nature took a far more prominent role in the 2020 elections when a global pandemic shifted the narrative out of the Trump campaign's influence and allowed his opposition to convince popular sentiment that they were better suited to lead the negotiations with nature. In both cases, the right and left wings found themselves in, to borrow a phrase from the communists, acting like reactionaries. When India became independent, its narrative channels were almost immediately dominated by anti-native ideologies, a term I use because these ideologies are violently antagonistic to native spiritual and philosophical traditions. These anti-native ideologies were well entrenched in the narrative channels and used their positions to project themselves as the rightful inheritors of independent India to the world. Entire university departments and armies of writers across the Western world were wooed to support the claims of the anti-native factions. To bolster their position, they used the new anti-imperial and anti-colonial studies, which generated such an overload of muddled ideas and double-speak that anyone with a college education could gain support for their cause by using the correct jargon. Within this swirling storm of self-interest, chauvinism, and wealth, a truly strange alliance was born, whose history we will eventually explore in detail. First amongst this faction were the scions of Nehru and the Congress Party, whose forebearers were the leaders of India's independence movement. Supporting them were the communist parties, collections of Christian churches, and various Indian Islamic associations. If this alliance seems absurd to the point of unreal, believe me, it gets stranger still. Communism, Christianity, and Islam are global ideologies with access to capital markets that span the whole world, against which the largely impoverished and internally divided native traditions had limited defense. Let the grim irony of the situation settle upon your mind. The alliance I've just described is India's left wing, the self-same left that in the Western world perceives itself as the stalwart defenders of anti-colonial and anti-imperial sentiment are, in India, the swords of three vast, global, ideological empires. Does political unity require cultural homogeneity? The calculated efficiency of the European expansion certainly demonstrates the value of enforced sameness. But does political unity actually require sameness? India is a dazzling panoply of color and sound, a world where, to quote the Zapatista rebels of Mexico, many worlds are possible. The Bharatiya Janata Party and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh certainly worked toward a politically united state, but showed little inclination toward imposing cultural unity. Despite the never-ending accusations of fascism and authoritarianism leveled at the RSS and BJP by their opposition, both seem disinclined to develop ancillary organizations that can dominate the narrative. Yet despite this lack of investment, a million narratives are still rising and carrying the BJP to victory in election after election. That tide is India's right wing. Nehru's dynasty is in its twilight years. Its heirs are hopelessly detached from India's masses. The communists too find themselves unable to win elections without support from Christian and Islamic orthodoxies. Meanwhile, the orthodoxies themselves struggle to prevent the Indian state, the physical manifestation of a resurgent cultural unity, from gaining enforcement capacity. Western activists, universities, and media organizations that oppose the Indic revival find themselves outmaneuvered by nationalist activists and native institutions. If, however, you cannot determine where you stand, it is difficult to gain a sense of direction. What do left and right actually mean to you? Are they descriptions of the role of government? A description of economic policies? A political tribe? Or something else entirely? The terms originated in France, where they described parties that sat on the right and left of an aisle that ran down the center of the legislature. In England, they described the Tories, traditional representatives of the gentry, and Labour, traditional representatives of the small merchants and workers. In the United States, they described the Republicans and Democrats, each with their own long and complex histories. The characteristics of the word, the substance that gives them meaning, shift and move like sand in water. In India, they define a struggle between the long-suffering native traditions and the remnants of bygone empires. And those, dear listeners, are two navigable coordinates upon our map: the Indic revival and the colonial remnants. This ends this episode of the Bones of the Empire podcast. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the content, please like, subscribe, and comment.